Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome back to my second week of Monday night, 9 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, chatting to you. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to so many people who I am told shared my last week chat with you. Both myself and my publishers and everybody associated with my stories are just delighted at how you have responded and yeah, wanted to ask more questions. Your compliments and your comments are just wonderful. So I start by saying thank you, or as they say in Slovakia, Ďakujem, if anyone from there is listening. Tonight I'm going to talk to you probably more at length about my next book. I think it's time, don't you? Come on, I've been putting teasers out there. So let me tell you some bits about it. I told you last week that I had to write this book because you made me do it. You made me do it because you asked so many questions. You shared so much of yourselves with me, particularly during sad and bad and tragic times. And because of that, I had this drawing to, well, let's talk about that. Well, I can't talk to you, but let's write about that. And that's what I've done, and that's what Stories of Hope is all about. When I was talking to my publishers and deciding, well, how do I start this? And the question came, of course, well, what's your earliest recollection of listening? Well, as you can tell, I've been around a decade or two, or six or so. But I do have one memory as a child of who I call the only person who I felt listened to me when I was growing up. It's a tough thing to say, isn't it? I lived in a family situation where there was 4 generations of us, only a matter of paddocks from each other. My siblings and I, and of course my parents, my grandmother, and my great-grandparents, 2 orchards away in that direction. But it was only the one person in all those family members, other than my dad. He was a reserved man, but one person in particular. Not only did he listen to me, but he talked to me, and he talked to me about himself, which was so rare for me growing up, for anybody to share anything personal about their lives and my family. I'm going to start off by giving you a little sneak peek at this man. I've got a photo here of him, and there he is there. His name is Christopher Charles Berry, and that's him holding a medal, and that medal is very significant. And I talk about what that medal is in my book, and I'll tell you a little bit about him too, because he, I believe, more than any person when I was growing up, made me into who I became. I found someone who could listen to me and talk to me. Now, Christopher Charles Berry was born in New Zealand, so that makes me a 4th generation, or fifth, might actually be 5th-generation Kiwi. And he came from a family that, well, there were rascals amongst them, so I've told. We've had a good look at it. But he was a very imposing man, and when I knew him, but then I started hearing about him as a young man, as a teenager. And that medal he's holding, that's a medal that he got from having served in the Boer War in South Africa. Now, I know that's a touchy subject, and for my friends in South Africa in particular, I was there last year and I mentioned it, and I got a lot of sideways looks. You know, we don't talk about the Boer War. Well, I have to, because it's significant to him, and it's significant to me because of the stories he told me about it. A young man living about, well, when I used to drive from where I lived in Parongia up to Auckland, it probably took us a couple of hours. I think it was about 100 miles. But when the Boer War broke out and the English, well, they came over to the colonies, didn't they? They came down to Australia and New Zealand. We're looking for cannon fodder. What else can you call it? Young men who wanted an adventure. Now, my grandfather was only, I think, 16, and his older brother told their parents, I'm going to go and sign up. To do that, he had to travel from Parongia, where we lived, to Auckland by horse. And so my grandmother asked Christopher Charles to accompany his brother, his older brother James. So these two young boys headed off on their horses, got to Auckland, got to wherever it was they had to go to for the James to enlist. And you know what the criteria was for being accepted as a soldier? You had to be able to ride a horse. That was it. Now, James, he got on his horse, he rode the required 200 metres or 200 yards, it would have been back then, and got, yep, you're good. And Gramps, who was just sitting on his horse at the end, just waiting for James to hurry up and finish so they could then begin the 3-day drive trip home. Somebody said to him, come on, your turn. Before he knew it, he had galloped the required distance and found himself signing up to get on a boat a few weeks later and go to South Africa. His story there, I will talk about more detail, but what I want to tell you about my connection to him was living those two orchards they were away from our house. My role as the only girl with 4 brothers was, of course, to have that nurturing role. That's how my mother saw it. Very distinct roles in life, boys and girls. Girl. In the morning on my way to school, I had to pass through my great-grandparents' home and check on my great-grandmother. She was pretty much invalided the entire time I remember her. And if she wasn't sitting in the kitchen, she was lying in bed. And I'd go in there and I would check on her. And I'd read her some headlines from the day before a newspaper. She just wanted the headlines. And that was my job. Read great-grandma the headlines and anything else she wants to know about. I would do that. And before I left, as I walked past her dressing table, I would play with a few beads and a set of pearls that she had there. And she'd growl at me, but I knew that she's no way she's getting out of bed to chase me away anyway. But in the afternoon, it was my job, though I never saw it as a job, to once again check on them on my way home. I always would find my great-grandfather sitting out the back of their property on his chair on the veranda, covered in veranda, and he'd just be sitting there. Beside him was great-grandma's chair, and he would just pat it for me to come and sit and join him. And that's where I would sit and listen. And he talked to me and he told me about his life. Sometimes he wouldn't say anything. He would just say, we're just going to sit and listen today, girlie. He called me girlie. He said, we'll just listen to what's going on around us today. And that would be more often than not the sound of cows mooing, dogs barking, chickens squawking, and my younger brothers, even though they were 2 paddocks away, fighting and yelling. Sitting with that old man and hearing his stories of being a young man and then a married man, a father, a grandfather, and now a great-grandfather was the best reward anyone has ever given me, because I learnt to listen, or not listen, just to be with, and sometimes that's all you have to do. Now, Stories of Hope, it talks about that whole notion of listening to our elderly, like my great-grandfather. Find neighbours, find anybody. Lully, of course, Lully. And now these 2 lovely ladies in Israel, Olivia and Magda. But I also go back and think about talking to our children, and in my case, grandchildren. And the difference that there is when you talk to your own children with all that limited time that you have, and now talking to my grandchildren, but more importantly, listening to them. I love listening to these young people. Just be an observer and watch how they interact. But also, and I mentioned it before, the importance of listening to ourselves. Now, this played out big time with me listening to Lully, because I didn't necessarily listen to myself many times, and I got caught out with it. When you're sitting listening to someone whom they're telling you stories of such terrible tragedy and trauma, it does happen that pain and that trauma and guilt can transfer from the person talking to you. And if you're not careful, it's going to land right on your shoulders. And then you need to first recognize that it's happened, or have somebody close to you, in my case, my family and my work colleagues, and point it out to you. hey, what's going on? Something's going on. And once you realize it, then you find a way of coping with it, strategies to deal with it, whatever works for you. Music has always been an important part of my life, particularly some parts of music and some styles of music, which I use to relax, to wind me up, and to, of course, wind me down. And when I was writing Lully's book, and I say book, not the screenplay, I was sitting in a cabin up in Big Bear in California, a mountain in the middle of winter, just me and a whole lot of snow and two squirrels. We became good friends over the 4 weeks I was there alone. Of course, I nicknamed them Almond and Cashew because that's what I fed them. But before I would start writing every day, and you've got to realize that I wasn't having to write his story from scratch. I had this amazing screenplay that had been developed with the help of producers and directors here in Melbourne. So I was just adapting that, so my life was a little bit easier. But before I started, I would listen to one particular piece of music every single day. It's a piece of music by a Polish conductor, and it's a symphony, part of a symphony called Songs for the Sorrowful. If you want to get into a mood of being absolutely in the moment, be it good, bad, or indifferent, this music is so hauntingly beautiful. It would set me back in that place. And of course, its title, Songs of the Sorrowful, it was written for the Holocaust victims and survivors. A great way for me to get into that mood, and I would stay there all day long, well into the night. But when it was time, generally about 2 or 3 in the morning, for me to switch off the computer and get some sleep, there was another piece of music I would then listen to. It was the piece of music that gave me hope that I was going to be doing a good job for Lully, that the story would get out there. And it's a piece of music that I haven't heard very often here in Australia, only really in the US, because that's where I first heard it. And it's by this amazing American singer called Andra Day. And the piece of music is called Rise Up. And I would rise up. I would get out of my chair and I'd be singing it along with her. I knew every word. And that was the importance of me in using another medium to be able to internalize what I was doing and get out of that same framework. And so that's where Stories of Hope and listening to Out the Elderly, my grandfather and Lully, comes from. And of course the children, well, I'd be careful here because there's a good chance anything I write, which I tended to perhaps gild the lily or embellish on with regard to what a great parent I was. There are 3 human beings in this world who may want to challenge me on that. But we'll have words when I hang up today and I'll set them straight. But as I say, now I get to listen to my grandchildren, and that's such a dream for me to listen to them and take part in what they're saying. Now, there are other aspects to listening, but also when you listen, you need, and you want to write about what you've been listening to, you need to honour those stories. And honouring Lully's story and Silke's story, yes, it's been a challenge because of the very style that I chose to write under, which was fiction, not a memoir. But you know, every time I still felt I was honouring their story as given to me in the first instance by Lully, but then Silke's story, of course, by people who knew her. And last week I spoke about being in Krompaki and meeting people and knowing people there who knew her, and what a treasure and a dream that was for me to be able to do that. You know, to be able to have all those raw edges knocked off from having heard the terrible storyline that Silke had lived under. And you must remember that until I went to Krompaki at the very end and I'd written the majority of her book, I only knew her story as it related to the trauma of being in Auschwitz and then in the Vorkuta Gulag. And there wasn't a lot of high points in it. But it was going to Krompaki and to Koshita and meeting people who knew her that then shone the light on this amazing girl, woman, and her life, and knocked all those raw edges off for me and gave me the confidence to say, yeah, I've got to tell her story. I always knew I had to, but I needed to be able to, as I say, feel like I was honouring her and her story, particularly in my writing, given I did not have her permission to write the story. What else are Stories of Hope about? Well, you know that there's got to be a comment in there, of course, about listening to our planet. Can I say, I don't think we've done a very good job of that in the last decade or two or three or four. And maybe it's time that we do. And because I'm an eternal optimist, I really believe that what we are currently enduring with this pandemic that's affecting us all, that we will learn from and that we will draw hope that we can now have a future for not ourselves, well, not when you're my age so much, but for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, by giving them a planet to inhabit that we can bring back from some of the terrible effects that man, has given to it. Yeah, I know there's scientists out there and there are people there that may not agree with me, but hey, this is my time, this is my event. I get to say what I think, and that's what you're hearing. So I naturally talk about that. I throw in one or two other storylines too that you don't know about, and because they're stories that I've also received from people. One in which I have written it as a screenplay, and I'm not quite sure what will happen. Actually, two. I talk about two in particular. These are true stories that I have received or been given 10, 15 years ago. And they exist as screenplays in the bottom drawer of my desk. Maybe they'll see the light of day because I just mention them to you in Stories of Hope. And if enough of you then write to my publishers and say, I really do want to hear about the head of security at the 1956 Olympic Games, or I really would like to hear more about the young boy in the hospital that Heather spent time with, then please, by all means do, and then they and I can talk. But because I write about them in Stories of Hope, because they also are the stepping stones for me to getting to where I am today too. You don't just meet one person like Lali, write a book and then go on and get on with your life. Well, I don't. I've been actually accumulating these stories over close to 2 decades. And now I get to tell you about them in this amazing book. Well, I think it's amazing. But you know why it's amazing? Because there are several people in my life. One lives here in Australia and the others are all in London. And I'm talking about, of course, my publishers and my editors and my manager. Brilliant. Oh, did I strike gold when I signed up with Bunya Zafra in London, and the wonderful people there that not only helped me write the books, but then helped me get them out there to you. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about a lady called Ruth, this amazing rights lady. She's called the rights director. She's the person who sells my book into all the other countries. So between them and my stories, we have thrown all my words up in the air. They have crash landed. Margaret and Kate have then rearranged them in this beautiful storylines, sent them back to me to say, now rewrite it. And that's what I've done. I think we're getting close to calling it It's a Wrap. I'll be kind of sad when that happens, actually, because I've so enjoyed doing it. There's something about writing nonfiction, and there were parts of it where I just mentioned little storylines because I actually didn't want to talk about me so much, and I was feeling that it was more about me, and it kind of is. It's my great-grandfather. But Margaret would write back to me and say, you need to expand on this. And she was giving me permission now to write more about me and my family and my upbringing and my life. Now, you might find that boring. It's possible. But look beyond it. It's not about me. It's about those people who have been in my life all these years and how They have been the ones to drive me forward and give me permission to now write these books that you seem to appreciate. We have some emails that have come in with some questions, and I'll get to them in a minute. But Stories of Hope is going to end, hopefully, oh, I love that word, with me giving you some more information about the three girls from Krumpaki who end up living in Tel Aviv in Israel and their amazing story. And that's what I'm going to straight away get on to writing. And if any of their family members in either Israel or in Canada, because they have family members in Canada, are listening or watching or tuning in, hello, Pam, Odie, Dorrit, you know who you are. I'm getting onto it as soon as this one goes to the publishers or to the printers, and I will tell their story. But I can tell it because I have hope that you want to hear it, because you've told me you want to hear these stories. You've told me that in a time like now, when we're all feeling so disconnected with each other, I'm not really crazy about sitting here looking at this tiny little pinprick of a camera on my laptop. The only thing about it is it's not asking me any difficult questions, so I guess there's that about it. But I'd give anything to be in a room with you. Trust me, I would, even with the tough questions that may follow. Let me answer some of these questions that we have got here, and then I'll see about how I can wrap up talking about Stories of Hope and give you a little teaser about what more I'm going to have a little chat to you about next week. I have to put my glasses on, okay? So here you go. This is what I generally look like for those of you who haven't seen me anywhere else. Lines has written saying, are you going to write a third book, maybe about Gita? No, I'm not going to write a story about Gita. Gita had not wanted her story to be told per se, and I will honour her and only telling her through Lali's world and his eyes and his memories. I think that's the best thing I can do. You know about Gita. Yes, read The Tattooist if you haven't already. Amazing lady, amazing girl. Somebody asked me just recently, what was it about her that so attracted Lali, given the circumstances of their meeting? Oh, I know who it was. I was talking to a young 14-year-old girl in Colorado a couple of days ago, and she wanted to know what was about her. And I said her eyes. Lali just focused on her eyes. He said they were black, but they were such a dark, dark, deep brown. But given the circumstances in which they met each other, they were still alive. They were fierce with determination, and that's what Lali saw in her through her eyes. This need to not be a zombie, not go with the flow, and he was just smitten by that. So in terms of Gita, I talk about her when I'm talking about Lali, but only in that context. Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca. I know Rebecca. When is the third likely to be released? It is September. I think next week, when we're actually going to show you the cover of it, I can give you the exact date, but from memory it's towards the third week of September. So not too far away. David. Hello, David. Now I know David too. He's in the UK, and he and I have corresponded several times, and we've even met. He was visiting Melbourne just over a year and a quarter ago, and we caught up for coffee. So David's asking about the film or the mini-series. I said last week, and nothing's changed, that this damn pandemic, it is going to affect the filming. Of course it is. And until things change, I cannot get you any further information on a timeline there. Kamoti wants to know which story was the hardest to write. Lali or Silka? Absolutely Silka. And the reason being that when I was writing Lali's story and it got all too much for me, I could go to him, and I would go to him, and he could comfort me. And I could share with him my worries and my concerns about telling his story, and he would then just give me permission to, you're doing it right, keep doing it, this is what I want. No, I didn't have that with Silka. I had nobody who could comfort me when I read the information being sent to me from my researcher in Moscow that outlined the horrors of the Gulag. I sat alone in my own office reading that, not even wanting to share that with my family. So, yeah, that was a tough one. Of course, until I got to Koshita and met her friends and neighbours, then that all changed. Carol says, "Hi Heather, I would like to ask you if I know if Silke ever had any further contact with Josie or Yelena." Now, several of you have asked me, Alexis, Anastasia, and Chloe. You're also asking about Josie and Yelena. Let me tell you about Yelena first. I knew from neighbours and friends and from, I think from what Geeta said about Silke, that there was a doctor who had saved her life. Not only saved her life, but who she had then subsequently visited in the Soviet Union when they were, well, when Silke was released and sent back home. And she tracked down Yelena, except Yelena is not her name. Her friends and neighbours who knew about the doctor did not or could not remember her name. You've got to remember, I was talking to people, once again, in their 70s, 80s and 90s, and they just said the doctor, the doctor. And so I tried to get the researcher to find out who was this doctor. Find me the names of the female doctor who were in Vorkuta when Silke was there. There was over 30 female doctors passed through that particular gulag. Well, that was no help to me at all. Now, I learnt where she moved to when she left Vorkuta. She went to Sochi in the Soviet Union and was working in a hospital there. So I had the researcher find me the names of female doctors in Sochi between these years. Same deal. Clearly, the Soviet Union was well ahead of a lot of other Western countries in having many, many female doctors working in their hospitals. So I have not been able to trace the exact person, and so her name had to be created. But who she is, that's not created. She existed. Now, the same thing for Josie. Josie existed as a young girl who was friends with Silke, who had a baby under the circumstances I describe. But again, the neighbours and friends could not remember the young girl's name that had the baby that Silke used to talk about. And no, there was no knowledge from the friends and neighbours that Silke was ever able to see them or catch up or find Josie again. So, fingers crossed that she and her baby went on and lived long and happy lives. So that's with those two. Any other characters in there that you want to hear about, please ask me about them. I'm very happy to talk about them and anybody else in Silke's story. In Silke's story, because I had to create it from reading testimonies from all these other brave, brave women who were in Vorkuta the exact same time that Silke was, so their descriptions, their testimonies, and their videos were how I was able to create Silke's story. Because Silke never recorded anything. She never wrote anything down. She only talked to friends and neighbours. But for me, that was enough. From what they told me and from what my researcher found out, I was able to create her story. I was able to, I didn't want to picture it, but sadly I did. Her existence. But then knowing that she went on and had this amazing life with her husband for nearly 50 years, both of them dying as elderly people, that's a comfort to telling her story. But hey, what a story it is. Isn't it an amazing story of survival, of hope, of courage, and of course love? The same elements that are in Lali's story, same elements that are going to be in my next story. Now, what's missing, I think, in stories of hope is, well, I suppose there's the courage of somebody like my great-grandfather at the age of 16 going to fight a war. His time in South Africa was very interesting. He didn't do any fighting, just by the by. His age, he was picked up and his age held it against him. He did stay there for, I think, about a good year, but not actually seeing or involved in any conflict. But really, the courage that I want to talk about comes, as I said, from you, or you wonderful people who have written to me. Because I know it takes courage to write letters like you have, sharing the kind of tragic events in your life, and then the lack of hope that you had while you were trying to grapple with this very personal trauma. That takes courage. And so, to all of you who have reached out to me like that, I honour and respect your courage in telling your story to me. Now, for those of you who feel that you'd like to write your stories, your story of hope, then we'd love to see them too. If you've had a look at the website, you will see that we are inviting you to submit your own stories of hope. Let us read them in your words. Often your emails, that you touch on them, you tell me a little bit about them, but I know that there's a lot of backstory and there's probably a lot of front story with them now as well, with the time passing. So why don't you have a go at writing them and hit that submit button and send them, and let my publishers and I have a look at them and read them, and we'll then contact you and let's see what we can do with them. Let's tell the world about your stories of hope. We all have it. We all want to continue having it. And one of the things that I say in my book, because it came home to me working in a hospital by a young teenage girl, when she overheard her parents outside her room in the hospital, being a very distraught situation, and heard her mother use the words in a very distressed state, "But she's dying." And when her mother came back into her room, this young teenage girl looked to her mum and said, "No, I'm not, Mum. It takes moments to die. The rest of the time we are living. With every breath we take, we are living." And I think that's a very appropriate thing for me to wish you good evening. And that ties in nicely, doesn't it, with what Lally used to say: if you wake up in the morning, it's a good day. It is, and it can be as simple as that. Look after yourselves. Stay safe. Stay indoors. Oh, by the way, if it's not obvious, I did break my social distancing rule today, and I did go to a hairdresser. It's the first time, honest, hand on heart, but the need was there. If I'm going to be sitting in front of you, I needed to have at least the fringe cut so that I could see you, or at least see that you could see my eyes. So thank you. Have a lovely evening. Have a lovely day. And I look forward to checking in again next Monday evening. And let's talk some more about stories of hope and where to from here. Thank you and good night.